In part 4 of How to Think About Climate Change, I talk about understanding our own limitations. It's the most useful part of all, with implications that reach into the darkest corners of your life. Let's dive in. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. This is part 4 in a 5-part series about how to think about climate change. 1. Scientific mindset. 2. The spirit of the debate. 3. Seeing the context clearly. 4. Understanding our own limitations, this one. 5. Finding our way to a solution. As human beings, we constantly think that we're good at forming our opinions on the evidence, but the research shows that this is not what we do. We shape our opinions based on how we think our peer group thinks. We jump to conclusions. We do all sorts of things that make us wrong without even noticing. By all accounts, there's nothing you can do to make yourself immune to these human limitations that we all share. But by being aware of them, we can become more humble about the chances of our being wrong about something, and that can help you to develop a strategy for coping with the possibility that your opinion on something is wrong. I'll give you a practical, non-climate change related example of the latter. Decades ago, when I was a younger man who socialised often with people who drank alcohol freely, I realised, and dare say I learned the hard way because that's how it tends to happen, I realised that you can do dumb stuff when you're drunk. I know, crazy, right? But I'm told this is definitely a thing. So without really intellectualising it, I created a mantra that my future slightly drunk self could remember whenever faced with the temptation to fire off an angry tweet or a snarky email or to make a move on a sexy woman or whatever it was. The mantra was this: if it's worth doing, it's better done sober. Simple, self-evidently true, easy to remember even when your brain is a bit foggy. I can't tell you how many mistakes and self-inflicted wounds that mantra helped me to avoid over the years, before I learned the alternative approach of simply not getting drunk. I told myself that I would come back to it when I was sober enough to do it properly, and of course 9 times out of 10, the sober you didn't think it was a particularly good idea in the first place. It was an example of understanding your own limitations, creating a strategy for coping with them. So, here's my take on some of those limitations. You may be able to add more. 1. Don't think you're supposed to know everything. When it comes to a complex scientific area such as climate, realistically, if you're not a trained scientist in the field, you can pursue the logical arguments and the evidence right up until you get to the part where it goes deep into the science. And if the mathematical equations start coming out and the deep knowledge of obscure chemical relationships becomes important, you can respond to that situation in 3 ways. 1 is to recognise the discussion goes beyond your area of knowledge and admit you don't know, and decide therefore you're going to trust the word of the professionals that do know, particularly if it's an aspect that the professionals don't debate or disagree on amongst themselves. Another is again to recognise that it goes beyond your area of knowledge, but decide that you're committed to knowing this stuff, and so resolving to do some self-study to improve the depth of the knowledge and competence that you have in this area, recognising that can be a non-trivial task if you're going to do it properly. And then the 3rd way is to refuse to accept that it's beyond your competence at all and to bluff your way through. And then, even if you feel you need to, just do enough research to find out what the agreed answer to the problem is by people on your side and simply accept that that's the truth. And we're entirely capable of persuading ourselves that we take one of the first 2 approaches while actually taking the 3rd. There are few limits to our self-deception. That's been proven in laboratory conditions. For instance, it's been shown that people taking part in a computer game where they have to take actions, but the outcome is actually unknown to them, programmed to be completely random, they will absolutely convince themselves that they've figured out how to make the program do what they want it to and that they're in control. And I've even seen that for myself. I knew one guy who was utterly convinced, totally sure, he'd worked out the rhythm of the fruit machines that he used to play on. And this meant that he won more often. And that wasn't a theory, it was a certainty. And I could see that he didn't win any more than anyone else. He didn't see it. He was completely unshakable. And that's kind of the point. The degree of certainty that somebody has in their belief has no observed correlation with how often they're actually right. None whatsoever. And this is something Scott Adams also points out in his book Loserthink. As far as the brain's concerned, being absolutely correct in your facts and absolutely being wrong in your facts feels the same. If you want evidence of the certainty thing, you only have to think back to the last time you had an argument with someone where you were 100% convinced that you were right, and your opponent was 100% convinced that they were right. Well, obviously, one of you at least was wrong. And of course, you assume it was the other person. It's patently obvious it was the other person, which of course is what they're thinking as well. So if it's possible to be wrong whilst being 100% convinced that you're right, it would be against the law of averages if it turned out that it only ever happened to the other people. I've read many autobiographies of the most successful, game-changing people in history. All of them confess to sometimes getting some things wrong. So if even the most successful amongst us admit that they got stuff wrong, must mean that the rest of us do as well, right? But well, maybe you're the first who never did, in which case you probably shouldn't be wasting your genius on YouTube comment sections. You should be out there changing the world. Now, of course, often it's just about not wanting to lose face. Personally, I think it's a strength to admit when you don't know something, except for the very occasional situation where you're really supposed to know that thing. But in a polarised argument, people will jump on you and try to exploit your admission as a sign of weakness. It's kind of up to you whether you accept their view on that. I would just suggest that you pay attention to what the smartest people in the room, or even the smartest people on the planet, tend to do. In my experience, the more people know about a subject, the more they acknowledge that there is still to know, and the less they worry about admitting it when they don't know something. The best scientists rarely express certainty. Deep knowledge of a subject makes you humble, not arrogant. So in that sense, you can take it that when it comes to a complex area, total certainty in your beliefs is likely to be inversely related to the chance of you actually being correct. Now, of course, even people with deep knowledge can go wrong, can become arrogant. The study I've mentioned before, How the Mighty Fall by Jim Collins, showed that the first stage in decline when a successful business sets itself up for failure is hubris. It becomes sure of its own brilliance and the sense that it can do no wrong. Well, good and smart people can do that as well. Indeed, a recent article suggested that it's almost a common outcome for Nobel Prize winners in the sciences. Lots of Nobel Prize winners ended up not only never again attaining the peak of genius that got them recognised in the first place, but many of them ended up moving into other areas that represented an extraordinary diversion of their talents, such as Kary Mullis, who was awarded a Nobel Prize for his work in molecular biology and promptly went on to advocate for a belief in astrology and claimed that he'd met an extraterrestrial glowing raccoon. Luc Montagnier, who shared the Nobel for discovering HIV and is now into homeopathy and DNA teleportation. Apparently one of the factors in the so-called curse of the Nobel is that winners often branch out into a discipline they're less familiar with, but carry with them an overconfidence that disregards the gaps in their knowledge. So if even the really smart people are susceptible, how do we begin to train ourselves to cope with the possibility that we're completely fooling ourselves? We evolved to survive by making use of one of our most amazing abilities, which is pattern recognition. Why do algorithms like YouTube algorithms, which have been designed by the smartest people and refined over decades, why do they so often need to be backed up by a human being looking at something, which they often do when judging whether something should be monetized or not, for instance? Because the human brain ultimately has a much better developed ability to see meaning, whether it's to do with intellectual meaning or discerning a face from what a computer would consider to be noise. In the earliest days of our evolution, that pattern recognition was there to keep us alive. It probably enabled us to tell the difference between the breeze fluttering the nearby vegetation and some would-be predator creeping up on us. Now, pattern recognition is a large part of how we make sense of the world. If you look at the face of someone you know, you just think, oh, there's Joe. You won't be studying the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the hair, the chin, all separately and thinking on reflection that those features are shaped and coloured in ways that on reflection you realise is associated with Joe. You just recognise the ensemble at a glance. Pattern recognition can lead us completely astray, or it can be a tool to challenge ourselves to see things more clearly. One example of how it can lead us astray would be, for example, when people say things like, those people were wrong in the 1970s, so they must be wrong again today. That's a pattern. In this case, it's a very sloppy pattern. In the past, people with that level of pattern recognition would probably have been saber-toothed tiger food. Let's just deal with why it's faulty. I mentioned in the last chapter, history does and doesn't repeat itself. So those people who were wrong in the past, first of all, were they really? Go back and double check whether what they said is actually what you're telling yourself they said, because very often it isn't. The Maldives will be underwater by 2020. Nope, they didn't say that. Manhattan will be completely underwater by 2020. No, not what he said. Secondly, let's suppose that you've got a bang to rights. Those people were wrong about that thing in the past. Are they actually the same people you're talking about now? It's not a convincing argument to suggest that some people were wrong in the past, so these totally different people must be wrong now. I mean, that's just dumb, right? But people do it all the time. Alarmists were wrong about X. Well, only in your head is there a group of people known as alarmists, whose members are so cohesive that the actions of one can be taken as a damning indictment of the judgment of all. But okay, let's suppose the very unusual scenario is true, and they were both definitely wrong in the past, and they're the self-same people you're looking at now. Probably they were also right in the past. As I said in the last chapter, history repeats itself because history is full of outcomes, and we can choose which ones to focus on. Have they actually had an illustrious career, with lots of good work to their name, but then this one glaring error that stands out? In which case, why are you promoting the error to greater importance than the rest of the work? Why do you assume that noticing the time that they were wrong gives you a better predictor of the future than the time that they were right? Should I use Caris Mullis's belief in the glowing raccoon to cast doubt on his work on DNA? I mean, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say maybe you wouldn't want to trust the glowing raccoon person's grip on reality enough to believe what they say on molecular biology. But you'd be wrong to say that. So it just shows that you should judge each position on its own merits. So you see what a lame pattern that is, and how quickly it falls apart under scrutiny. And that's the other side. You can use your talent for pattern recognition to spot the warning signs that should alert you to the probability that at least some of the things you believe may be on dodgy foundations. So for instance, if the whole underpinning principle of climate science was flawed, as some people think, you'd have to explain why thousands of smart, well-motivated scientists seem to believe that they're doing serious and useful work. Or if you live on the other extreme, if we're plunging headlong towards near-term human extinction, you'd likewise have to explain why those thousands of scientists don't agree with that. And it's easier to fool yourself on that one, because those scientists are concerned with our current direction, and indeed many are very worried indeed. But they're not saying that the children of today won't get to grow old, as some people say. Now, this doesn't mean that there can be no circumstances when all the practitioners of a profession can't be trapped in a prison of confirmation bias, but it would be an extraordinary aberration. And you'd expect to see signs of a conflict this would create in those thousands of people. You'd see signs of researchers struggling to resolve the contradictions they kept noticing. And no, I don't mean the handful of campaigners with science credentials. Credentials or not, they're combatants on the field of battle. Generally, we won't notice the patterns that should alert us to our possible mistakes because we don't look for them. More often, we're looking for the signals that confirm what we believe, whether those signals are true or not. If I'm in a relationship and I believe my partner loves me deeply, I'll probably notice all sorts of little things that confirm that belief. If, on the other hand, I'm utterly convinced that she's a horrible liar and she's always lying to me, then I'll start to collect evidence to back that belief up, and I'll find it wherever I look. Even if she doesn't actually lie, I'll be convinced it's utterly self-evident that she does. Now, both of those scenarios have the same potential for self-delusion, not just the second one. It's just that with the first scenario, assuming that she loves you will lead you to behave in such a way that's more likely to create the reality you already believe to be true. Whereas the destructiveness of the second one, unlikely to end so happily. The hardest place to come back from is when you've built your entire worldview on your absolute certainty, backed up by dodgy pattern recognition and false signals. In that state, you'll filter all of the inputs you think are correct and reject the rest. You'll judge people on how well they align with your worldview. You'll never learn from your mistakes because your world is one self-reinforcing bundle of confirmation. I once had the question asked of me, why is it that some of the older people I meet have become wiser with age, but then others just get stubbornly fixed in their ways and just get angry at the world? And I think the answer to that question is here in what we've just been talking about. People who remain open to the possibility that they're wrong notice over and over again the times when they were absolutely certain they were right and life proved otherwise. Those people get wiser because they learn about the world the way it is and they learn not to jump to conclusions. For people who filter the world to fit with their preconceptions and preferences, those are the ones who get stuck in their ways because they never get challenged. They never have to adjust and the world changes around them and they conclude it's all because the world is wrong and that's why they become angry. The exciting thing about all of this is the realization that you have a choice about the sort of person you become. It's not easy, it takes practice, but whether you grow old to be wise or grow old to be a cantankerous old git, it's completely up to you. And it's late in the day for me, but I still feel like I could go either way.